Practice standing still, feet glued to the floor. Talk. Just talk. Tell them what you found. That's all you gotta do. What's up, sons? It's Blind Rod with Son of a Tech once again. Today we're going to be checking out the Gigabyte RX 550 and if it can play modern AAA titles. I'm not so interested in the esports aspect because frankly everybody else has already done it, and if you guys are playing League of Legends you can play it on a potato, so in my opinion it's kind of irrelevant. But can we play, let's say, Mass Effect Andromeda at 1080p on the RX 550? Let's see. To start things out, as always, let's talk about the test bench, which is an i7 7700K overclocked to 4.8 GHz, mated to an MSI Gaming M3 Z270 motherboard with 16 GB of DDR4 clocked at 2400 MHz. While I know that this GPU in particular wouldn't necessarily ever go into a machine like this, it definitely guarantees that you're seeing the most performance you would ever get out of an RX 550. Now, the Gigabyte trim of the RX 550 has a pretty tiny single fan solution with a decent heatsink, but nothing that's going to be covering your VRMs. The input output's going to basically be a single DVI, a single HDMI, and a single DisplayPort 1.4 port. Now, when I say input output, of course there is no input on this. This isn't a capture card, so derp. And you will not have any power requirements, or at least PCIe power requirements. A thing to note here though is that the card's TDP rating is 50 watts, which means if you're looking at trying to boot off something like a server rail, which I don't know why you would, but I have done that with GT 730s in the past, just because I've needed something for random purposes and just for wanting to have fun. That was definitely when I was messing with Engine X back in the day. But if you were looking at maybe having an option for that on the AMD side, the RX 550 isn't going to quite cut it there. I am curious if we could get a bootable at 35 watts from the GT 1030, or I guess the GTX 1030 now, and I definitely want to get my hands on one of those and put this card up against it. So before we finally get into the benchmarks, let's go ahead and take a listen to the fan noise. Be sure to pay attention to the prompts so you know when to turn your speakers up and when to turn them back down, so I don't blow your ears out when we get back into talking about the card performance. So starting things off, I'm going to go ahead and talk about the game that pretty much demolished it, or made it to the point to where you're going to have to knock down resolution or downscale resolution to get a playable experience. And that's going to be Mass Effect Andromeda. Unfortunately, the best you're going to see out of this is going to be about 12 frames per second on the minimum, with a max of 20 and an average of 15.6. Of course, this is maxed out in Mass Effect Andromeda, which is a later title and has already been known to push hardware with its poorly animated facial features. It, however, doesn't look that bad when you put it up against its bigger brother, the RX 462 Gigabyte, and I don't know, it doesn't seem like it's that much of a hit, and you're saving about $20 to $30 depending on which exact trim of each of these you decided to go with. However, if you did just go ahead and purchase an RX 550, there is hope. There is light at the end of the tunnel, and we can see that with Outlast 2 at max settings in 1080p, where the RX 550 2GB had a nice playable minimum of 30 FPS with an average of 38.02 and a max of 47. Albeit this game isn't particularly demanding, and I can't really tell you that this is going to stay true for most AAA titles, especially as they start adding in more features and so on and so forth. I would say though that Outlast 2 looks pretty good. I mean, the trough, I think there's like a trough scene where you see like the water going back. The physics in that are fantastic. So, I mean, while the game isn't that demanding, I think that the game isn't that demanding because of the lighting more so than the texture quality used or the physics quality used. Next we have Prey, which is one of the latest titles that I've done all of my benchmarking in. And the RX 550 does quite well with a min of 22, an average of 30, and a max of 41. And just with a few settings tweaks, it's not that hard to get a 1080p 30 FPS playable experience, or even higher, where you can see about 40 frames on your average with dips going to maybe like 35. And it looks good and it's smooth while it does it. So those are pretty much two titles right there in a row where the RX 550 shows that it can go ahead and play some AAA modern titles. Unfortunately, finally, and not least, is the Surge, which is the latest benchmarks I've done. You can check them out here. And the RX 550 2GB had a minimum FPS of 20 with an average of 25.77 and a max of 31. Now, with turning the shadows all the way off, you would get a 30% gain, which would give you about 6 FPS on the minimum, which would get you up around 26. Unfortunately, yeah, that means that no, it's not playable quite. 30 FPS is about minimum for playable in my experience. So you will be looking at needing to use that resolution scaling option in the Surge to get a decent experience. Of course, 900p and low shadow should get you right around there, and turning maybe some of the textures down should get you there as well. In conclusion, I find that the RX 550 is a decent option for $80, and while I did say in the beginning that I wasn't interested in the esports options, that is a legitimate concern for some people, and you might want to take a look at a couple other videos, which I'll leave in the description below if you're looking for a little bit of extra performance for your esports competitions. If you guys are looking for a cheap graphics card that can essentially play AAA modern titles at 1080p, you might want to look elsewhere. But if this is all you can afford and you don't have the option of looking for something used, you do have the option of the RX 550. As long as you're okay with either scaling resolutions or playing at lower resolutions, you might be fine. This is also not such a big deal with things like resolution scaling that does perform quite well, and most of the later titles are coming with it just by default in the settings menu. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you next Tuesday.